Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive deep into the true scale of the deadliest conflict in human history. We'll be looking strictly at the hard data, the cascading chain of events, and the stark, undeniable realities left behind by a war that completely reshaped the world we live in.
Okay, let's jump right in. We're actually going to start not at the beginning, but right at the devastating climax. Picture this. It's the morning of August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. Suddenly, an atomic explosion over Japan generates temperatures between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. In an absolute instant, normal life, kids walking to school, folks commuting to work, is just replaced by this towering ball of fire and smoke. It literally felt as though the sun had touched the earth. A second bomb followed on August 9th, which forced Japan's surrender and brought a terrifying, abrupt end to the global conflict.
So how in the world do we reach that horrific morning? Well, we're going to follow this roadmap. 1. The seeds of conflict. 2. Hitler's rise to power. 3. A world divided. 4. Key turning points. 5. The global aftermath. And finally, 6. India's struggle and sacrifice.
Number 1. The seeds of conflict. To understand the Second World War, we actually have to jump back in time and see how the end of the First World War, ironically, planted the seeds for the Second. The harsh demands of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles laid the exact groundwork for future disaster. You see, driven largely by France's desire for security, which makes sense, they shared a direct border, the victorious Allies stripped Germany of its wealth, 13% of its territories, and heavily restricted its military. France even demanded the demilitarization of the Rhineland region and forced a war guilt clause. This basically pinned the entire blame for the First World War squarely on Germany.
And the bill for that blame? £6.6 billion. That is a staggering, impossible financial reparation forced upon Germany's newly formed government, the Weimar Republic. To pay it, they did the only thing they could think of. They printed massive amounts of money. And as you might guess, it completely collapsed the German economy. Hyperinflation became so wild that people were using wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. Children were literally playing in the streets with stacks of worthless currency like it was Lego.
Number 2. Hitler's rise to power. Let's see how all of this widespread economic desperation perfectly paved the way for some really radical political shifts.
So, for a brief window in the 1920s, American financial aid through the Dawes Plan actually helped stabilize Germany. But then, the 1929 Wall Street crash hits, triggering the Great Depression. That vital American money vanished overnight. By 1932, German industrial production had plummeted by 40%. A shocking 6 million Germans were left totally unemployed. You've got this desperate, frustrated population standing in the streets, begging for any kind of work, and they were entirely ready to listen to extreme promises.
Enter Adolf Hitler, a phenomenal public speaker. He rapidly capitalized on that national anger, promising to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore German pride. It happened so fast, in 1933 he's appointed chancellor, and quickly passes the Enabling Act to make himself an absolute dictator. He pulls Germany out of the League of Nations, aggressively reclaims the Rhineland in 1938, and starts absorbing neighboring territories like Austria and Czechoslovakia.
Number 3. A world divided. As Germany expanded aggressively and faced basically zero consequences, the globe fractured into two massive, opposing military alliances. The world became terrifyingly polarized, setting up an absolute, inevitable clash. On one side, you have the Allied forces, primarily the UK and France, later joined by the USA, the Soviet Union, and China. On the other side, the Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy. Now, fun fact, Italy had actually fought with the Allies in World War I, but feeling ignored and economically drained by those peace settlements, they swapped sides to align with Germany this time around.
What made this global division so uniquely catastrophic was the nature of the conflict itself. Unlike any previous war, this became a total war. Every factory, every scientific mind, every scrap of metal was mobilized. And tragically, this meant that ordinary civilians, their homes, and even their hospitals were now considered completely valid military targets by all sides. The line between a soldier and a regular citizen was completely erased.
Number 4. Key turning points. With the stage set and the world divided like a powder keg, a series of rapid, devastating military moves ignited the globe. The sheer speed of this escalation was mind-boggling.
It officially kicks off in September 1939 when Germany stages a fake attack to justify invading Poland, which finally forces the UK and France to declare war. Incredibly, by June 1940, German forces bypassed direct borders and forced France to surrender in just days. Then, in 1941, the war expands massively when Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa. And later that very same year, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor finally pulls the full might of the American military directly into the conflict.
But then the tide turns dramatically. Hitler makes a fatal strategic error. He breaks his non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union to chase his long-held desire for Eastern territory. While he was initially successful, his advancing army got trapped by the absolutely unforgiving, freezing Russian winter. The Soviet army capitalized on this instantly, violently pushing the German forces back. Now fighting a brutal two-front war, Soviets in the east, British and Americans in the west, Hitler was ultimately cornered, right in Berlin.
Number 5. The global aftermath. Following the fall of Berlin and those devastating atomic bombings of Japan we talked about, the fighting finally stopped. But the true horror of the war's scale was just starting to come into focus.
The unprecedented human cost of total war is it's hard to even comprehend. Out of the roughly 60 to 80 million total deaths, a staggering 50 million were everyday civilians. Actually, scratch that. Let's just pause and think about that. 50 million civilians compared to 25 million soldiers. It was a level of devastation humanity had never, ever seen before, completely changing the moral landscape of warfare forever.
As the dust settled, the geopolitical map of the world was entirely rewritten. The League of Nations, which had completely failed to stop the war because it basically lacked a standing army, was replaced by the newly birthed United Nations. Meanwhile, Germany was split right down the middle into East and West, controlled by the victors. The two remaining superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, plunged straight into a decades-long Cold War. And simultaneously, the weakened European powers faced a rapid, unavoidable decline in their global empires.
Number 6. India's struggle and sacrifice. Now, we often view this war strictly through a European or Pacific lens, right? But we really must turn our attention to the massive and honestly often overlooked sacrifices made by the Indian subcontinent.
Because India was still a colony under British rule at the time, they had absolutely no choice. They were automatically pulled right into the Allied war effort. India ended up deploying an immense, world-changing force of 2.5 million soldiers to fight against the Axis powers.
Tragically, the human cost for them was immense. Around 87,000 of those Indian troops lost their lives fighting on foreign soil. On top of that, tens of thousands more were severely wounded, and over 67,000 Indian soldiers were taken as prisoners of war.
But here's the thing. The sacrifice wasn't just happening on the battlefields of Europe or Asia. Back home, the British policy of aggressively exporting local Indian food and resources to fund the war effort completely crippled the civilian population. Imagine this. Workers in places like Bengal were paid in cash rather than grain, but with all the food being exported, local food prices skyrocketed completely out of reach. This pushed millions of women, children, and elderly folks right out onto the streets.
This systematic economic drain directly triggered the devastating 1943 Bengal famine. While Indian grain was literally being shipped off on boats to feed British soldiers abroad, an estimated 3 million Indian civilians perished from starvation and rampant disease right at home. This immense local suffering, combined with Britain's sheer military and economic exhaustion from the global war, fundamentally changed the course of history for the subcontinent. It served as the final spark, the catalyst that empowered massive, unstoppable movements like the Quit India movement. The British government, severely weakened, realized they could no longer suppress the unrest. This forced their departure, leading directly to Indian independence in August 1947.
So, as we wrap up this explainer and look back at the ashes of 1945, we see a world completely transformed. Borders were redrawn, entire empires crumbled, and modern international institutions were born. But as we reflect on the staggering 80 million lives lost, from the frozen fronts of Russia to the starved streets of Bengal to the blinding atomic flashes over Japan, all to secure our modern world, we're left with a vital question to ponder. What is the true price of peace, and are we truly honoring that staggering cost today?